The rain came sideways that night, and the wheel of the carriage snapped like a bone breaking clean in two. Eleanor Hale felt the whole world tilt before she heard the crack. One moment she was pressed against the window, watching the dark hedges rush past, and the next she was thrown against the door, her bonnet crushed, her heart slamming so hard she could feel it in her teeth. The horses screamed. The driver shouted something she could not make out over the storm. Then everything stopped, tilted at an angle that made her stomach lurch, and she understood that she was not going to reach her aunt's house that night. She was going to be stranded, alone, on a public road, in the dark, with a storm coming down like the sky itself had a grudge against her. The driver managed to get her out through the door that faced upward. Her slippers sank into mud immediately. There was no moon, no lantern that would stay lit, nothing but black fields and the distant, blurred glow of a window half a mile down the road. An inn. It had to be an inn. She gathered her skirts, already ruined, and walked toward that single point of light because there was nothing else to walk toward. The innkeeper's wife took one look at her and gasped like she had seen a ghost. Eleanor did not blame her. She must have looked like something dragged out of a river. Her hair had come loose from its pins, mud climbed halfway up her hem, and her hands would not stop trembling, though whether from cold or fright she could not say. She was given a chair by the fire and a cup of something warm that tasted like burnt cider, and she was grateful for it in a way she had never been grateful for anything in her life. It was nearly an hour later when the door opened again, and a man walked in shaking rain from his coat, like a dog shaking off a lake. She recognized him before she wanted to. Julian Ashworth, Viscount Rothmere, was not a man easily forgotten, not because he was charming, for he was not, and not because he smiled often, for he did not, but because there was something in the set of his jaw that made rooms go quiet when he entered them. She had met him twice, once at a ball, where he had said perhaps 4 words to her the entire evening, once in a hallway, where he had stepped aside to let her pass and said nothing at all. He stopped in the doorway. Rain dripped from the ends of his hair onto the collar of his coat. He looked at her the way a man looks at a problem he has not yet solved. "Miss Hale," he said. That was all. 2 words. But 2 words were enough, because the innkeeper's wife had already begun whispering to her husband behind the bar, and the words traveling between them were not kind ones, and by morning Eleanor understood with a sick, sliding certainty this small country inn would not be the only place those words traveled. By the time she reached her aunt's house 2 days later, the story had already outrun her. A viscount and an unmarried woman, alone at a country inn overnight, no chaperone, no explanation that anyone cared to hear over the much more delicious explanation they had already invented for themselves. It did not matter that nothing improper had passed between them beyond a nod and a shared fire that neither of them chose to sit near. It did not matter that they had spoken perhaps 20 words to each other in total, most of them about the weather. The story people wanted was already better than the truth, and truth, Eleanor was learning, rarely wins against a story people want. Her aunt's face when she arrived told her everything. "They are saying," her aunt said, not even offering tea first, "that you spent the night in his bedchamber." "I spent the night by a fire, in a common room, with an innkeeper's wife asleep in the next chair. Do you think that matters to anyone who is currently enjoying themselves at your expense?" It did not matter. Eleanor understood that within the week, invitations that had once come regularly to her aunt's house stopped arriving. A cousin who had once written her cheerful letters twice a month sent one cold note asking her not to visit until things settled. Settled, as if this were weather, as if this were something that would simply pass over like a storm and leave the fields as they had been. It would not. Eleanor had watched other women live through smaller versions of this exact ruin, and she knew what happened to them. They did not recover. They faded into corners of drawing rooms, unmarried, untouchable, spoken of in tones people used for things gone slightly bad in a larder. She was 22 years old. She had thought, before the wheel broke, that her life still had several roads open to it. Now there seemed to be only one. Julian Ashworth arrived at her aunt's house 8 days after the inn, and Eleanor knew before he said a single word why he had come, because she had seen this exact visit paid to other families, though never to her own. His mother, the Dowager Viscountess, had not made the journey with him, but her presence hung over the conversation regardless, the way a held breath hangs over a room before a scream. Eleanor was told later, from a maid who heard it from another maid, that Julian's mother had set a tea tray down so hard it cracked the saucer, and said, in a voice with no warmth left in it at all, that she had 4 unmarried daughters left in this family, and she would not watch every one of them go unmarried behind a story that was not even true, because society did not care whether it was true. Society cared whether it was interesting. Julian sat across from Eleanor in her aunt's small drawing room, his hat in his hands, his back too straight, like a man reporting for an unpleasant duty rather than paying a call. "I expect you know why I have come," he said. "I expect I do. I will not pretend this is anything other than what it is. I do not know you well enough to have formed an attachment to you, Miss Hale, and I suspect the reverse is equally true. But my family's name and yours are already tied together in every drawing room in this county, and there is only one way I know of to make that tie honest instead of shameful." Eleanor looked at her hands. "You are asking me to marry you to fix a story that never should have existed in the first place." "Yes." At least he did not dress it up as anything softer. She had expected flattery, false warmth, some performance of feeling meant to make the transaction easier to swallow. He offered none of it. He sat there, plain and cold as a closed door, and told her the truth, which was somehow both worse and more bearable than a lie would have been. "And if I refuse, then you remain what the story has already made you, and I remain what it has already made me, and neither of us gains anything from the refusal, except the comfort of having said no to something we both know we cannot afford to say no to." He was not wrong. That was the cruelest part of it. Eleanor turned the offer over in her mind, the way she might turn over a stone to check what lived beneath it, and found nothing beneath it but the same hard, flat truth. She had 4 choices left in her life, and 3 of them ended with her alone in a room somewhere, being spoken of, never spoken to. "Very well," she said. He did not smile. He did not look relieved. He simply nodded once, the way a man nods when a business arrangement has been concluded to satisfaction, stood, and said he would send the necessary papers within the week. Eleanor sat alone in the drawing room long after he left, listening to the clock on the mantel, and found she could not decide which frightened her more, the scandal she was leaving behind her, or the marriage she was walking into, to a man who had looked at her the entire conversation as if she were a debt he intended to pay off promptly and without interest. She did not cry. She had promised herself, somewhere between the broken wheel and this drawing room, that she would not cry over a life she had not chosen, because tears changed nothing, and she needed all her strength for what was coming. She would need every last measure of it, though she did not yet know how much, or why. The wedding took place 3 weeks later, in a chapel that was, by any honest account, too large for the number of people who actually wished the couple well. Eleanor stood at the front of it in a gown that had been finished in a hurry, feeling the weight of dozens of eyes on her back, all of them curious, none of them kind. She heard the whispers even over the vows. She heard a woman 2 rows back murmur to her companion that the bride did not look particularly joyful for a woman who had just caught herself a viscount, and she heard the companion answer that joy was hardly the point of this particular wedding. Julian's hand, when he took hers at the altar, was steady. Hers was not. He said his vows in a voice with no tremor in it at all, the voice of a man reciting a passage he had memorized and did not particularly feel, and when it came to her turn, Eleanor found she could barely produce sound, not from sorrow, exactly, but from the strange, hollow sensation of watching her own life happen to someone else while she stood inside it. Afterward, in the carriage that would take them to his estate, neither of them spoke for the first several miles. Rain streaked the window again, lighter this time, more like tears than storm. "You did not look at me once during the ceremony," Julian said finally, not as an accusation, simply as an observation, the way he might note that a road had gone muddy. "I did not think you wished me to." "I did not say that." "No," Eleanor agreed. "You did not say anything at all." He turned to look out his own window then, and she watched his jaw tighten in the dim light, and she thought, not for the first time, that she had just married a man built entirely out of closed doors, and she had no idea, not the faintest idea, what waited for her behind any of them. She would learn. It would take longer than she expected, and cost more than she could have imagined on that carriage ride, but she would learn, eventually, that some of the doors he kept shut were not locked out of coldness at all. Some of them were locked because he was afraid of what would happen if he opened them. Rothmere House was not what Eleanor had expected, though she could not say afterward what exactly she had expected instead. It was large, certainly, built of gray stone that seemed to hold the cold of every winter it had ever survived, with corridors long enough that a person could walk the length of one and hear their own footsteps echo back at them like company. It was beautiful, in the way old things are beautiful, worn smooth by centuries of hands, but it did not feel like a home. It felt like a house that had been waiting a very long time for someone to fill it, and had grown tired of waiting. Julian showed her through it himself on the first day, though showed was perhaps too generous a word. He walked, and named rooms as they passed them, and did not slow his pace to let her linger in any of them. "The library," he said, gesturing at a set of double doors without opening them, "the east drawing room, my study, which I would ask you not to enter without announcing yourself first. Is there a particular reason?" "I keep papers there I do not wish disturbed." It was said plainly, without heat, but Eleanor filed it away regardless. One small brick in the wall she was already beginning to understand made up the whole of him. He answered questions. He did not offer information. If she wanted to know something about her own husband, she would have to ask for it directly, and even then, she suspected, she would only be given the smallest portion of the true answer. Her own rooms were pleasant enough, connected to his by a shared sitting room neither of them used. A maid named Grace was assigned to her, a cheerful girl not much younger than Eleanor herself, who seemed to be the only person in the entire house willing to speak more than was strictly necessary. "His lordship doesn't say much," Grace admitted on the second morning, brushing out Eleanor's hair with more gentleness than the topic probably required. "Never has, not since I've been here, and that's been going on 4 years now. His mother says he was different before his father passed, but I couldn't tell you the truth of that, milady. I never knew him then." "Different how?" Grace hesitated, the brush pausing mid-stroke. "Warmer," she says. "I don't know that I believe it," meaning no disrespect. "Some men are just built quiet." Eleanor turned the thought over for days afterward, examining it the way she might examine a coin found on the ground, unsure of its value, until she could see both sides of it clearly. A man built quiet, or a man made quiet, by something that had happened to him before she ever arrived to witness the aftermath. She began, without quite deciding to, cataloging him. He rose before the sun and worked in his study until breakfast, which he took alone unless she specifically requested his company, a request she made exactly once in the first month, and did not repeat, because the meal had passed in such total silence that she had left the table hungrier for conversation than she had been for food. He rode out most afternoons, alone, returning windburned and unwilling to discuss where he had been. He read, she discovered, an enormous amount, and read widely, poetry and history and books on farming methods that seemed, from the wear on their spines, to have been read more than once. He was not cruel. She wanted to be fair in her accounting of him, and cruelty was not among his faults. He never raised his voice to her, never spoke sharply, never made her feel small in the particular way some husbands, she had heard, made a habit of. He was simply absent, even when he was present, a man standing in a room while the better part of him remained somewhere she could not follow. And yet, there were small things. She noticed them the way one notices a single crack running through an otherwise smooth wall, easy to miss unless the light caught it just so. A book appeared on her nightstand one evening, one she had mentioned, in passing, wishing to read, during a conversation she had assumed he had not been listening to. A passage inside it was underlined in pencil, faint, as if he had done it, and then thought better of leaving evidence of the effort, though he had not erased it. She read the underlined lines a dozen times, searching for meaning in his choice of them, and found none she could prove, only a feeling, warm and unfamiliar, that someone had been paying more attention to her than he let on. Another time, she mentioned to Grace, in an idle moment, that she loved the smell of the orchard behind the stables, but rarely had occasion to walk that way, since her mare's usual path took her nowhere near it. 3 days later, without a word from anyone, the groom began walking her that long way round each morning, and when she asked him why, he only said he had been told to, and would not say by whom, though Eleanor did not need him to. She mentioned neither incident to Julian. She was not certain why, perhaps because naming it aloud would force it into the light, and she suspected, without being able to explain the suspicion, that whatever small warmth he was capable of required darkness to survive in, the way certain flowers only bloom at night and wilt the moment the sun finds them. 3 months into the marriage, his mother came to visit. The Dowager Viscountess arrived with the particular energy of a woman who had spent her entire life managing rooms and did not intend to stop simply because she was a guest in one. She looked Eleanor over the moment she arrived with an expression that was not unkind, exactly, but was thoroughly assessing, the way a merchant looks over a bolt of cloth before deciding what price it merits. "You have not gained weight," the dowager observed at dinner, apropos of nothing, "which tells me either the cook here is worse than I remember, or you are unhappy. Which is it?" "The cook is quite good, my lady." "Then you are unhappy." Eleanor said nothing, which the dowager appeared to take as answer enough. She turned her sharp attention to her son instead. "Julian, have you spoken to your wife today? We have had breakfast together. Speaking is not the same as sitting in the same room chewing food. We spoke of the weather." "Wonderful," the dowager said, in a tone that suggested it was anything but. "I raised you better than this. I know I did, whatever you might currently believe about yourself." Julian's jaw tightened, the same way it had in the carriage on their wedding day, and he did not answer, and the dinner continued in a silence that felt, for the first time since Eleanor's arrival, deliberate rather than merely habitual. She realized, watching him stare at his plate, that his silence was not simply his nature. It was armor, worn so long he had forgotten how to remove it, even when the battle it was meant for had long since ended. After his mother retired for the evening, Julian found Eleanor in the small sitting room between their chambers, something he had not done before, not once in 3 months. "My mother is difficult," he said, by way of apology that was not quite an apology. "She loves you. It shows, even in the difficulty." He looked at her for a long moment, longer than he usually allowed himself to look at anything, and Eleanor felt the strange sensation of being truly seen for the first time since the wedding. "She is not wrong," he said finally, "about the breakfast. About the weather." "No," Eleanor agreed, "she is not. I do not know how to do the other thing, the sitting in a room, chewing food, as she put it. It has been a long time since I have had practice at it, and I find I have grown rather bad at things I once did without thinking." It was the most honest thing he had said to her since the drawing room where he had proposed a transaction rather than a marriage, and Eleanor found she did not know what to do with the honesty, only that she wanted more of it, the way a person standing in a cold room wants more of a fire even after the first warmth has reached them. "We could practice," she offered, "if you wished it." He considered this with the seriousness he seemed to bring to everything, as though even small kindnesses required careful weighing before he would risk them. "I would like that," he said. "I think." It was a beginning, small, uncertain, the kind of beginning that could still fail at any moment, but a beginning nonetheless, and Eleanor held on to it that night, the way a person holds on to the first warm day after a long winter, unsure whether to trust it, hoping regardless that it meant the season was truly turning. They did not become effusive with each other. Julian was not built for effusiveness, and Eleanor had learned by then that asking him to become something he was not would only send him further behind whatever wall he had built. But small things changed. He began joining her at breakfast without her asking. He began, occasionally, to offer an opinion unprompted, on a book she was reading, on a piece of news from the village, on nothing important at all, but offered nonetheless, which felt, from a man who rationed his words like a miser rationed coin, like an act of considerable generosity. One evening, several weeks after his mother's visit, Eleanor found him in the library, a room she had rarely entered because he so rarely invited her into it. He was seated by the fire, a book open on his knee that he did not appear to be reading, staring instead into the flames with an expression she could not read. "May I sit?" she asked. He looked up, seemed almost startled to find her there, and then nodded, moving slightly to make room on the settee, though there had been ample room already. They sat in silence for a while, the good kind, the kind that does not need filling, and then, without any preamble at all, he spoke. "My father died in this room," he said, 3 years ago, in that chair, the one you are sitting in now." Eleanor went very still. "I am sorry. I did not know." "You could not have known. I do not speak of it. I have not spoken of it, in fact, to anyone, not even my mother, though I suspect she assumes I have grieved it properly by now, the way one is meant to grieve, in an orderly progression toward acceptance." His voice was flat, controlled, the voice of a man handling something sharp with great care. "I have not. I do not know that I ever will. I simply learned to be quiet about it instead, and I believe, somewhere in the process of that learning, I forgot how to be anything else." Eleanor did not reach for his hand. She sensed, correctly, that he was not offering this to be comforted, only to be known, and there was a difference between the two that she was only beginning to understand in him. "Thank you," she said instead, "for telling me." He nodded once, and turned back to the fire, and neither of them spoke of it again that night, but something had shifted between them regardless. A door that had opened only a crack, enough to let a sliver of light through into a room that had been dark for a very long time. Eleanor began, that night, to understand that she had not married a cold man at all. She had married a man who had built himself an entire house of silence to survive a grief he had never let himself finish, and she was, whether she had intended it or not, becoming the first person in 3 years he had let stand near the door of it. She did not know yet what would happen when the door opened fully. She would find out soon enough, and not in the way either of them expected. Autumn came to Rothmere House the way it comes to old country estates, slowly, then all at once, turning the orchard gold and then bare within the space of a fortnight. Eleanor had grown accustomed to the rhythm of the place by then, the early mornings, the quiet breakfast that had become, against all odds, something she looked forward to rather than dreaded. Julian still guarded his words carefully, still retreated to his study when the weight of a conversation grew too heavy for him to carry in the open, but he no longer vanished behind those retreats the way he once had. He came back. That, Eleanor had learned, was the difference that mattered. It was at a dinner in the neighboring county that the first true threat to their fragile peace arrived, wearing the shape of an old friend. Edmund Carlyle had known Julian since they were boys together, sent off to the same school, and he greeted Julian at the Ashfords' dinner table with the loud, easy familiarity of a man who believed old friendship excused any manner of behavior. "Rothmere," he said, clapping Julian on the shoulder hard enough that Eleanor saw him stiffen. "Married. Who would have thought it? And to such an interesting story, no less." "Edmund, come now. Don't look at me like that. Everyone at this table has heard the tale. There's no sense pretending otherwise among friends. The broken wheel, the inn, the scandal that practically forced your hand." Edmund turned his attention to Eleanor with a smile that did not reach his eyes. "Miss Hale, forgive me, Lady Rothmere now, isn't it? You must tell me, was it terribly romantic, being rescued that way, or terribly inconvenient?" Eleanor felt the old familiar heat rise in her chest, the same heat she had felt in her aunt's drawing room all those months ago, the sense of being discussed rather than spoken to. She kept her voice even. "It was terribly wet, Mr. Carlyle." The romance, I understand, was invented afterward by people with more imagination than manners. A ripple of laughter went around the table, and Edmund's smile thinned slightly at the edges, the way a man's smile does when he has been bested and is deciding whether to acknowledge it gracefully. "Sharp tongue on this one," he said to Julian. "Suits you, I suppose. Better than the alternative." "What alternative would that be?" Julian asked, his voice gone quiet in the way Eleanor had learned meant danger rather than calm. "Only that I heard you did not choose her so much as you were left with no other choice." No offense meant, of course. We all know how these things happen. A man's name gets tangled with a woman's, and suddenly duty does the choosing that the heart never got the chance to. The table had gone quiet enough that Eleanor could hear the clock somewhere down the hall. Julian set down his glass with the careful precision of a man controlling something that wanted very badly to be uncontrolled. "You will not speak of my wife's honor at this table again," he said, "or anywhere else within my hearing, Edmund. I say this as your friend, so that you understand it is meant kindly, and only once." Edmund raised both hands in mock surrender, laughing it off, turning the conversation elsewhere with the practiced ease of a man who had spent his whole life smoothing over the messes his mouth created. But Eleanor saw something in his eyes before he looked away, something that unsettled her far more than the insult itself had. It was not embarrassment, it was calculation. She mentioned it to Julian in the carriage home. "He does not like that you defended me." Edmund does not like being corrected by anyone, in any matter, regarding any subject. It is his oldest and least attractive quality. Is there more to it than that? Julian was quiet for a long moment, watching the dark hedges pass the window, the way she remembered him doing on their wedding day. "Edmund and I were close once, closer than brothers, for a time. There was a woman, years ago, before you, that we both wished to marry. I won her hand, or so I believed at the time. She died before the wedding, a fever, very sudden, and Edmund has never entirely forgiven me for having had her at all, even briefly, even though I lost her just as completely as he did." Eleanor sat with this new piece of him for a while before speaking. "You have never mentioned her." "I do not often let myself think of her. It does not seem fair to you, to carry her ghost into a marriage she has no part of. I would rather know the truth of you, ghosts included, than be protected from a version of you that is not entirely real." He looked at her then, really looked, the way he had that night in the library, and something in his expression softened into an emotion Eleanor did not yet have a name for, though she suspected, with a small thrill she did not examine too closely, that it might one day become something very close to love. "I will try to remember that," he said. "It does not come naturally to me, the offering of truths. I have spent a long time believing silence was safer for everyone involved. Safer, perhaps, but lonelier, I think, for you most of all." He did not answer that, but he took her hand in the dark of the carriage, the first time he had done so without occasion or ceremony, simply because he wanted to, and Eleanor held on to it the entire ride home, unwilling to be the one who let go first. Edmund Carlyle did not let the matter rest. Eleanor learned this over the following weeks, in the way one learns a storm is coming, through small signs before the thing itself arrives. A letter came to the house addressed to Julian in a hand Eleanor did not recognize, and he read it in his study with the door closed, and emerged afterward with a stillness about him that felt different from his usual reserve, sharper somehow, like a blade freshly honed. "What did it say?" she asked, though she suspected already that he would not tell her the whole of it. "Edmund has been talking, in town, about the circumstances of our marriage. He has apparently decided that since he cannot have what he believes should have been his, he will at least ensure no one forgets how it came to be mine instead." "Talking how?" Julian's jaw worked once before he answered. "Suggesting that I trapped you, deliberately, that the broken wheel was engineered, that I wanted an heir and a story that would let me claim honor while avoiding the messier business of courtship. It is not true, not a word of it is true, but truth, as you have already learned the hard way, is rarely the thing that determines what people choose to believe." Eleanor felt the old fear return, colder now, because this was not merely gossip about a stranger's misfortune. This was gossip that could unmake the fragile, hard-won peace she and Julian had built between them, brick by careful brick, over months of small kindnesses and harder honesties. "What will we do?" "Nothing," Julian said, and for a moment Eleanor feared he meant to retreat again, back behind the walls she had only just begun to see past. But then he continued, and she understood she had misjudged him. "We will do nothing, because there is nothing to defend against an accusation with no proof behind it, except to live in a way that makes the accusation obviously absurd to anyone with eyes to see it. Edmund wants a reaction. He wants to see me flinch, the way I flinched once before, when I lost something I could not get back. I do not intend to give him the satisfaction." It was, Eleanor thought, the bravest thing she had heard him say since the wedding, and she found herself standing a little straighter for having heard it, the way one stands straighter in the company of someone who has decided not to be afraid. They hosted a dinner of their own the following month, a small affair, meant, though neither of them said it aloud, to answer Edmund's whispers with something sturdier than denial. Eleanor oversaw every detail herself, the flowers, the seating, the particular wine Julian preferred but rarely requested because he did not like to trouble the staff over his own comfort. She wanted the evening to reflect something true, not a performance of happiness, but the real, imperfect, hard-won thing they had actually built. It went well, better than well. Julian, for the first time in Eleanor's memory, laughed at the table, a real laugh, startled out of him by something his old school friend Henry Whitmore said about a horse race gone disastrously wrong, and the sound of it seemed to surprise him as much as it delighted everyone else at the table, including Eleanor, who found she wanted, more than she had wanted almost anything in her life, to hear it again. Edmund was not invited. He heard of the dinner regardless, as Eleanor suspected he was always meant to, through the same channels his own gossip traveled, and whatever effect the news of it had on him, it did not stop the whispers entirely, though it slowed them, the way water slows when it meets a stone placed deliberately in its path. It was 2 weeks after that dinner that Eleanor woke with a scratch at the back of her throat. She assumed, at first, was nothing more than the change of season settling into her chest the way it did every year around this time. She did not think much of it. She had a household to run, a husband whose trust she had only just begun to fully win, and a village fair to attend that Saturday that she had been looking forward to for a month. She took a spoonful of honey in her tea, told Grace not to fuss, and went about her day as though her body had not already begun, quietly, without asking her permission, to fail her. By evening, the scratch had become a cough. By the following morning, the cough had become something with weight to it, something that rattled in her chest when she breathed too deeply, and Grace's cheerful chatter while brushing out her hair had gone quiet with concern she was trying, not very successfully, to hide. "You ought to rest today, milady, if you don't mind my saying." "It is only a chill, Grace. I have had worse." But she had not had worse, not truly, not since childhood, and some part of her, some old animal instinct buried beneath the polite fiction she was telling herself, already understood that this particular illness had teeth in it that her usual autumn colds had never carried. Julian noticed before she was willing to admit it herself. "You did not eat your breakfast," he observed, 3 days after the cough began, watching her push a piece of toast around her plate without lifting it to her mouth. "I am not hungry." "You are flushed. It is warm in here." "It is not," he said, and there was something in his voice, an edge of the old wall reforming, not out of coldness this time, but out of something that looked, to Eleanor's tired eyes, remarkably like fear. "Eleanor, look at me." She lifted her eyes to his, and whatever he saw there made him push back his chair immediately and cross the room to press the back of his hand against her forehead, a gesture so unlike him, so sudden and unguarded that she felt a flicker of alarm purely from the surprise of it. "You are burning," he said quietly. "I am fine." "You are not fine. I am sending for the physician." "Julian, it is a chill. Nothing more. I have had a dozen of these." "I do not care what you have had a dozen of before," he said, and his voice had gone low and hard, in a way she had never heard directed at her, only ever at Edmund, only ever at people who deserved it. "I care what you have now, and what I am looking at now frightens me more than I am willing to explain to you while you are sitting there insisting you are well." He sent for the physician within the hour. Eleanor, too tired suddenly to argue further, allowed herself to be walked back to her rooms and settled into bed, and it was only once she was lying there, the fever beginning to build behind her eyes like a slow rising tide, that she let herself feel the fear she had been holding at arm's length all morning. Something was wrong, something more than a chill, more than the change of season, something that had crept in quietly while she was busy defending a marriage from gossip, and had chosen this exact moment, when she had finally let herself believe in a future worth protecting, to make its true intentions known. She thought of Julian's face when he touched her forehead. She thought of the woman he had loved once, the one who had died of a fever very sudden, before the wedding could take place, and she understood, with a clarity that frightened her more than the fever itself, exactly what fear she had just put behind his eyes. She reached for his hand as he sat beside her bed, waiting for the physician to arrive, and found it already reaching for hers. "I am not going anywhere," she said, though her voice had already begun to shake with something other than cold. "No," Julian agreed, holding her hand, as though letting go of it might undo the promise entirely. "You are not. I will not allow it." Neither of them yet knew how much that promise would cost him to keep, or how close he would come, over the 6 days that followed, to losing the thing he had only just learned he could not survive losing twice. The physician's name was Henry Colby, an older man with steady hands and a voice trained over decades to deliver bad news gently, which made it no less terrible to hear. He examined Eleanor with careful attention, pressing his fingers to her wrist, listening to her chest, with an ear pressed close enough that she could feel his breath against her skin, and when he finally straightened, his expression told Julian everything before a single word was spoken. "It is a putrid fever," Colby said, "aggressive. I have seen it move through a household before, though rarely with such speed in a single patient. The next several days will tell us a great deal." "Tell us what?" Julian asked, his voice flat in the way Eleanor recognized now as the sound of him holding himself together by main force. "Whether her body has the strength to fight past it. And if it does not?" Colby did not answer that question, which was in itself an answer, and Eleanor watched something break loose behind Julian's eyes, something that had been held in place for 3 years by careful, disciplined silence, and was now coming apart all at once, in front of a physician neither of them knew well enough to hide from. "There must be something more you can do," Julian said, "something more than waiting. We keep her comfortable. We keep the fever from climbing too high too fast. We wait, my lord. I am sorry. I know it is not the answer you want, but it is the only honest one I have." Julian sent for a second physician that same afternoon, a younger man from the county town with newer methods and less patience for waiting, and when his opinion matched Colby's almost exactly, Julian sent for a third, from as far as 2 days' ride away, though the man would not arrive in time to offer anything the first two had not already said. Eleanor, drifting in and out of a fever that had begun to blur the edges of the room, heard all of this the way one hears a conversation happening in another house, muffled, distant, important in a way she could not quite reach. She remembered fragments of that first night clearly, the cold cloth against her forehead, replaced again and again by hands she recognized without opening her eyes, the sound of Julian's voice, low, continuous, though she could not follow the sense of the words, only the shape of them, steady as a heartbeat in a room that otherwise felt like it was tilting. She did not remember him leaving. Later she would learn, from Grace, from the housekeeper, from every member of the household who dared speak of it at all, that he had not left, not once, not for the whole of the 6 days that followed. He did not change his coat. That detail, small and strange, seemed to matter most to the staff, who repeated it to each other in the kitchens like a piece of evidence in a trial none of them had been asked to judge, but all of them wanted to understand. The Viscount Rothmere, who took his meals alone, who guarded his study like a fortress, who had not, in 4 years of service from most of the staff, raised his voice above a murmur, was sitting in a chair beside his wife's bed, in the same coat he had worn the morning the fever began, refusing every suggestion that he rest, refusing every offer to relieve him even for an hour. On the second night, the fever climbed high enough that Eleanor began speaking in a fractured, half-conscious way, words that made no sense strung alongside words that made too much sense, memories surfacing without order, her mother's voice, the broken carriage wheel, a fear of drowning she had not felt since childhood. Grace, sitting with a basin of cool water in the corner of the room, later told the housekeeper she had never in her life seen a man look so afraid and so determined at the same time, as though fear and resolve had become, for him, the exact same expression. "Stay with me," Julian said to her, over and over, through that second night, his hand wrapped around hers so tightly Grace worried, briefly, that he might hurt her without meaning to. "Eleanor, stay. I am not asking you for very much. Only this." She did not answer, could not, but something in her hand tightened around his in response, some small, animal certainty that reached him even through the fever, and he held on to that small pressure the way a drowning man holds on to driftwood, unwilling to examine too closely whether it would actually be enough to save him. By the third day, Julian had stopped speaking to the servants except to issue instructions. He ate only what Grace brought directly to the sick room and set within his reach, and even then, ate very little of it, his attention fixed entirely on the bed and the woman in it, whose breathing had grown shallow enough to frighten even Colby, who returned twice daily now instead of once. It was on the third night that Julian began to talk, not to the room, not to the servants, but to Eleanor herself, in a voice that had abandoned every wall he had ever built around it. "I never told you," he said, holding a cool cloth to her forehead with a gentleness that surprised even himself, "about my father's dogs. There were 3 of them when I was a boy. Enormous, badly behaved animals my father loved more than most people, I think, though he would never have admitted it. The largest one, Bram, used to follow me everywhere, into the stables, into the orchard, once into the church during a christening, which caused a scandal my father found endlessly funny and my mother did not find funny at all." He paused, watching her face for some flicker of recognition, and found none, but continued anyway, because the words had become, by then, less about reaching her and more about keeping himself from drowning in the silence of the room. "I have never told anyone this, but I paid off your brother's debt to the tailor in town, the one he thought no one knew about. I did it before we married, before I had any reason to do you a single kindness, because I heard of it by accident, and could not bear the thought of your family suffering one more indignity on top of the one I was about to hand you. I never told you because I did not want you to think I expected gratitude for it. I did not do it for gratitude. I do not know why I did it, except that even then, before I understood any of what I felt, some part of me had already decided you mattered." He kept talking. Through the 4th night, through hours that blurred together into a single long vigil, he told her things he had never told anyone, not his mother, not Edmund, not even, he suspected, himself, not in words this plain. He told her about the woman he had loved before her, the one lost to a fever much like this one, and how terrified he had been, the moment Colby said the word putrid, that history had simply circled back to collect a debt he thought he had already paid in full. He told her, in the deep hours of the 4th night, when the house was so quiet even the servants had stopped moving through the halls, that he had been jealous, at their own wedding breakfast, of a groomsman who had made her laugh with an ease Julian himself had never once managed, and that the jealousy had frightened him so badly he had said nothing about it to anyone, because a man who did not intend to feel anything for his wife had no business feeling something as undignified as jealousy over her laughter. "I intend to feel a great many undignified things where you are concerned," he told her, his voice cracking on the words in a way it had never cracked before, not even in the library, not even speaking of his father. "I have decided this somewhere in the last 4 days, sitting in this chair, watching you fight something I cannot fight for you, no matter how much I want to. I would give a great deal to fight it for you. I would give everything I have. I find I do not know how to be a man who has nothing left to give, and yet here I am, giving nothing, because there is nothing left that helps." The servants, passing the door, heard him say her name that 4th night, in a way none of them had heard him say anything before. Not an instruction, not a habit, but something closer to a plea or a prayer, the kind offered by a man who had never learned how to pray and was doing it badly, honestly, for the first time in his life. The 5th day brought no improvement, but no worsening either, which Colby called a mercy, though it did not feel like one to Julian, who had begun to understand that waiting without progress was its own particular species of suffering, one that ground a person down more slowly and more thoroughly than any single terrible piece of news could have done. He did not leave the chair except when Colby insisted on examining her privately. He slept, when he slept at all, sitting upright, his head tipped back against the wall, waking within minutes at the smallest change in her breathing. The household, by then, moved around the sick room in a hush, usually reserved for churches, aware that something was happening behind that door that mattered more than any of the small daily business of running an estate, and every one of them, from the youngest kitchen girl to the oldest groom, found some reason to pass the corridor outside that room more often than their duties strictly required, as though proximity to the vigil might somehow help it succeed. It was in the early hours of the 6th day, in that thin gray time before true dawn, that Eleanor's fever broke. Julian felt it before he understood it, a change in the heat of her skin under his hand, subtle at first, then unmistakable, sweat breaking across her forehead in a way that Colby, roused from a brief and reluctant sleep in the next room, confirmed within minutes, was the fever finally releasing its hold. "It is turning," Colby said, pressing his fingers to her wrist, with an expression of relief so plain it startled Julian nearly as much as the news itself. "Her pulse is settling. My lord, I believe the worst of it has passed." Julian did not speak. He could not. He sat very still, his hand still resting against her damp forehead, and felt something break loose inside his chest that had nothing to do with fever and everything to do with 6 days of a fear he had not allowed himself to name even once, not to Colby, not to his mother, not even, until that 4th night, to Eleanor herself. He wept then, quietly, the way a man weeps who has not allowed himself the practice of it in a very long time, and no one in the house begrudged him the sound of it, because every one of them had spent 6 days waiting for exactly this outcome and understood, better than most, precisely what it had cost him to wait for it without breaking entirely. Eleanor stirred, some hours later, into a room grown soft with morning light, and found a man beside her bed she barely recognized, unshaven, hollow-eyed, still wearing, impossibly, the same coat he had been wearing the morning her fever began. "Julian," she whispered, her voice raw from disuse. He was at her side before the word had fully left her mouth, his hand finding hers with a speed that spoke of 6 days of practice at exactly this motion. "I am here," he said. "I am here. You are going to be well. Colby says the worst has passed." She looked at him for a long moment, taking in the exhaustion carved into every line of his face, the coat, the stillness of a man who had clearly not moved from that chair in longer than was reasonable for any human body to endure, and she understood, without yet knowing the details, that something enormous had happened in the space of the days she could not remember. "You look terrible," she said, and her voice cracked into something that was almost a laugh. Julian's own laugh, when it came, was rough with disuse and relief in equal measure, the sound of a man remembering, all at once, how to be something other than afraid. "Yes," he agreed, "I imagine I do." Recovery came slowly, the way strength always returns slower than it leaves, but it came steadily, and within a week, Eleanor could sit up unaided, and within 2, she could walk the length of her own sitting room without needing to rest halfway. Grace fussed over her with undisguised delight, bringing broth she insisted was strengthening, and bread she insisted was easy on a recovering stomach, and the whole household seemed, in those first weeks, to move with a lightness Eleanor had not noticed missing until it returned. Julian did not leave her side, not truly, even once the physicians pronounced her safely past danger. He took his meals in her sitting room rather than alone in the dining hall, a habit neither of them discussed, but both of them seemed to have silently agreed upon, and in the evenings, when she was strong enough to sit by the fire rather than remain in bed, he read to her from whatever book she chose, his voice steady now in a way it had not been steady during those 6 days, though something in him had shifted permanently, she thought, something that would not go back into hiding the way it had before the fever. It was nearly 3 weeks after she woke that Eleanor finally asked him the question she had been circling since that first morning. "I remember fragments," she said, watching the firelight move across his face. "Not sentences, not whole thoughts, only pieces, like something heard through a wall. You spoke to me, during the fever. I know you did. I can feel the shape of it even though I cannot recall the words." Julian was quiet for a long moment, and Eleanor watched him consider retreating, watched the old instinct rise in him, the pull toward silence that had governed him for 3 years before she arrived and had only recently begun to loosen its grip. He did not retreat. "I told you about my father's dogs," he said instead, his voice steady, though his eyes remained fixed on the fire rather than on her. "About a debt of your brother's. I paid before we married, which I never told you about because I did not want you to feel obligated to me over it. About Margaret, the woman I loved before you, and how afraid I was, sitting beside you those 6 days, that I was about to lose a second woman to the exact same fever that took the first, as though some cruel symmetry in the world had decided I was owed this particular grief twice." Eleanor's hand found his without needing to be asked. "I told you," he continued, "that I was jealous of a groomsman at our own wedding breakfast, because he made you laugh in a way I did not yet know how to. I told you a great many things I had never told anyone, because somewhere in that first terrible night I understood that if I lost you without ever having said them, I would spend the rest of my life exactly as silent and exactly as alone as I was the day we married, and I found, sitting in that chair, that I could not bear the thought of that particular future nearly as much as I feared losing you at all." "You married me," Eleanor said slowly, "to silence a scandal." "I did. And now—" He turned to look at her then, fully, the way he had that night in the library when he first told her about his father, and something in his expression had gone soft and unguarded in a way Eleanor had never seen on him before, not even during the fever, not even in the deepest hours of that vigil. "Now I would marry you 100 times over, scandal or no scandal, if it meant I ended up exactly here, in this chair, with your hand in mine, having nearly lost you and been given, against every reasonable expectation, a second chance to say what I should have said from the very beginning." He paused, and something like humor flickered at the corner of his mouth, the first true lightness she had seen in him since before her illness, "which is, in the plainest words I have, that I love you, entirely. I did not intend to. I fought it, badly, and lost, and I find I am not the least bit sorry to have lost." Eleanor felt something break open in her chest that had nothing to do with fever and everything to do with 3 years of a man learning, one careful halting step at a time, how to stop hiding from his own feelings, and she leaned forward and kissed him, gently, mindful still of her recovering strength, and felt him kiss her back with a certainty that told her, more clearly than any words could have, that whatever walls had once stood between them had finally, entirely, come down. The matter of Edmund Carlyle resolved itself in a manner neither of them had anticipated, though perhaps, Eleanor thought later, it was the only manner that truly suited a man like him. Word of the 6 days spread through the county, the way such things always spread, servant to servant, then shopkeeper to customer, then finally into the drawing rooms where gossip had once painted their marriage as nothing more than a scandal quietly managed. But this particular story, the true one, of a man who had not left his wife's side for 6 days and nights, who had wept openly when her fever broke, who had, by every account, been utterly undone by fear of losing her, was not the story of a cold, calculating marriage of convenience that Edmund had spent months trying to construct. It was, instead, a love story, and love stories, Eleanor discovered with some wonder, traveled through drawing rooms with an appetite every bit as hungry as scandals, and considerably kinder in its telling. Edmund's whispers withered under the weight of a truth too vivid and too widely witnessed to argue against. Even those who had once enjoyed repeating his suggestions found themselves, within weeks, repeating instead the story of the Viscount who sat 6 days in the same coat, refusing to leave his wife's side, and Edmund, faced with a narrative he could no longer control, retreated from society for a season and returned, eventually, chastened in a way that suited him rather better than his previous confidence ever had. He called on them once, the following spring, an awkward, halting visit, during which he apologized, stiffly but sincerely, for the things he had said and spread in the months before Eleanor's illness. Julian accepted the apology with the same plain honesty he brought to everything now, neither warmly nor coldly, simply as a fact to be acknowledged and set down, and the two men, if they did not return fully to the friendship of their boyhood, found at least a truce that let old wounds close rather than continuing to fester. Eleanor thought of that broken carriage wheel often, in the years that followed, the storm, the mud, the single point of light that had led her toward a marriage she had not chosen and had been so certain, in the beginning, would cost her every happiness she might otherwise have found. She had been wrong about that, as it turned out, wrong in the most complete and grateful way a person can be wrong. The scandal that had forced them together had faded, as scandals eventually do, replaced in the memory of the county by a far better story, one about 6 days and a silence finally, fully broken. Julian never did become a man who spoke easily, or often, or without careful thought first. That part of him remained, woven into the fabric of who he was, and Eleanor came, in time, to treasure it rather than wish it away, because she understood now that his silence had never been indifference. It had been a wall built by grief, brick by careful brick, and she had been given the rare and precious privilege of watching him take it down himself, one honest word at a time, until there was nothing left standing between them at all. They had a daughter the following autumn, born on a clear, cold morning, with none of the drama that had marked her parents' own beginning, and Julian held her, that first evening, with the same careful, complete attention he had once given only to his silence, and Eleanor, watching him from the bed, thought that she had never in her life seen a man look so thoroughly, so permanently undone by happiness. "What shall we name her?" he asked, not looking up from the small, sleeping face in his arms. "Something that means she was worth the storm that brought her family together," Eleanor said. Julian smiled, the easy, unguarded smile that had once been so rare in him and had become, over the years since her fever, simply a part of who he was. "Then we shall have to think carefully," he said, "because I do not believe a single name could carry the whole of that." Outside, the last of the season's rain moved gently across the orchard, the same orchard whose scent had once been carried to Eleanor by a groom acting on instructions he would not name, in the earliest days of a marriage that had begun as nothing more than damage control, and had become, against every reasonable expectation either of them had once held, the truest and most complete happiness either of them had ever known.